Hey guys, I'm Step. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about PUBG video settings. Let's get straight into the video. Okay, so the first setting that I want to talk about is monitor resolution. You want to make sure that you have resolution here set to your monitor's native resolution. As you can see, I have a 1080p monitor, and I want to make sure that I keep it set to that because you want to make sure that you're not going lower or higher than your monitor's native resolution, because if you go lower you will get an increase in frames, but you also won't have as much clarity on your screen, so it make it a lot more difficult for you to spot enemies at those longer distances. And within PUBG, you want to make sure that you can see enemies before they see you. Like this game is basically based around spotting enemies first and like your position and everything. You can go higher. You can also overclock your monitor to go to a higher resolution by using the DSLR factors within NVIDIA control panel. I wouldn't recommend doing this because it's going to cost you a lot of frames, and if you're trying to push to a higher resolution, it will make the image a lot clearer, but it's going to decrease your frames per second. So I'd recommend that you stick with your monitor's native resolution here. Okay, so the next setting that I want to talk about, guys, is brightness. Personally, I like to keep it at 50, the default value, because I feel like if I go above 50, it starts getting too bright for me. I know a lot of players do play on higher brightness settings, like around 80 to 100. I know personally Shroud and Dr. Disrespect play on 81. I like to have it set to 50 because I feel like the contrast between the terrains and the brightness of the sun and the brightness of the enemies is easier for me to see. I'd recommend that you try between 50 and 100. This is very personal preference based, so you guys are going to have to decide what you like to use and what makes it easier for you. It all depends on what you find easier to see, if you like it brighter or a little less bright and the contrast is a little bit stronger for you to see those enemies at longer distances. But yeah, I'd recommend that you try between 50 and 100 and see what works best for you guys. Okay, so on to render scale. Render scale essentially changes your resolution that the game is rendering in. I recommend keeping this set to 100 because I feel like if you go higher than 100, it starts giving you a massive decrease in frames per second. And I also feel like it doesn't make a huge difference. I think the benefits of keeping it set to 100 and changing it to 120 are very, very slim between having it on 120 and staying with 100. So 100 make sure that it renders within your monitor's native resolution, which is whatever your monitor is. Mine personally is 1080p, but the higher you go, the higher the resolution it's going to render at. It's going to downscale at a higher resolution. If you go lower than 100 on the render scale, it's going to make the screen very blurry because it's going to lower your resolution that your game's actually rendering in, and it's going to make things very difficult for you to see at long distances. Personally, I would recommend you set this to 100 and stick with 100. Don't change this because your FPS will be a lot higher. You will be able to see enemies at 100. 120 doesn't make a huge difference in my opinion, and you get those added frames per second. I believe it's 45% more frames having it set to 100 than 120, so that is a big jump between frames per second. So keep this set at 100, guys. Okay, so on to field of view. This only affects first person perspective, so if you do not play first person only, I would recommend that you just skip this completely. Just ignore what I'm just about to say about this setting. Personally, I like to have it set to 103 because like I said before, guys, PUBG is a game where you need to spot enemies before they spot you, and I think having it set to 103 increases your peripheral vision. So when you're looking around, you're gonna see a lot more than you would at say 90. A lot of my other games that I play, I like to have it on 90, but PUBG specifically, I think you need to have it maxed out just to have that spotting down, and you'll get used to it. If you play at 90 usually and then you start playing at 103, the more you play this game, the more you're going to get used to it and you'll get better with your aim. Because I know it's very weird when you first start off at 103 because it took me a while to adjust to it, but I really like having it set to 103 now because it helps me with my spotting, and I see enemies that I wouldn't have seen at 90 field of view. Okay, so on to anti-aliasing. I had a very tough time choosing whether or not I wanted to have anti-aliasing on or off. Personally, I think there's advantages to both having anti-aliasing off and anti-aliasing on. I think having anti-aliasing off puts you at a disadvantage to see moving enemies because of the jagged edges that having no AA on adds. But I think having anti-aliasing on also makes it more difficult sometimes to see enemies that are standing still, because I feel like their player models start to blend in with the surfaces, like their contrast starts to blend in with other surfaces and makes it more difficult when an enemy is stood still. I think you guys need to try for yourself whether or not you want to choose very low or go with ultra or another setting. Personally, I like to keep it set to very low because I think it makes player models stand out, but it can be difficult for me sometimes when a player is moving behind, say, a fence or something like that, because they start to become difficult to see because of the jagged edges. But I like to keep it set to very low. Okay, so moving on to post-processing. Essentially what this does is add shadows to your game. I would recommend keeping this set to very low to get rid of all shadows within your game, because it's going to make it easier to see those enemies that are maybe in a corner. Like, they're going to be easier to spot, and you're not going to have like very dark areas within buildings, and this will make it a lot easier for you to see those enemies that are maybe hiding around a corner, or like in a corner that you may not have noticed if you had your post-processing set up onto like ultra or high or something like that. I would recommend setting this to very low, guys. So on to shadows. Shadows is essentially pretty much the same thing as post-processing. Essentially what shadows does is changes the details of like how detailed within enemies shadows are going to be, or tree shadows, or within buildings, stuff like that. I'd recommend you set this to very low as well, because you don't really want to be playing with shadows anyway, because it's going to make it harder for you to spot enemies in those darker corners around the map and stuff like that. So I'd recommend setting this to very low as well, just keeping that set to the lowest so you make sure you don't have any shadows within the game that are going to make it more difficult for you to distinguishedly see those enemies that you may have missed if you had shadows on. Okay, so moving on to textures. Basically this determines how good the whole entire game's gonna look. So having it set higher will make player models look better, it will make vehicles look better, the ground look better, trees, everything. Like, this determines how good the game's gonna look. Personally, I like to have this set to ultra because I think it weighs in with anti-aliasing. Where I play on very low anti-aliasing, I feel like higher textures makes it easier for me to spot enemies at further distances because of the details, and it makes like enemies stand out a little easier, and it makes it a little bit easier for me to see them at those longer distances. Personally, it all comes down to how much FPS that you get within your game. If you guys don't have such a good PC like I have, that can give you the frames that push up to your refresh rate of your monitor, then I'd recommend playing this on a little bit lower than ultra. But personally, I like to have it set to ultra, and if you guys can do it, I recommend you guys play on ultra textures as well. Okay, so next up on the list is effects. All this does is essentially change how fire and smoke grenades and shooting looks on your game. I don't think having this change between very low and ultra makes too much of a difference. You might be able to see gunshots a little bit easier, but I feel like having the increased FPS of having this on very low, I don't think it makes too much of a difference whether you have this set to very low or ultra. This isn't going to change any difference between you spotting, other than maybe seeing gunshots a little easier because they're going to be in more detail. But this is up to you guys. Like, if you wanna have this set on anything else other than very low, you can go ahead. But personally, I like to just leave that on very low. I don't think it makes too much of a difference in terms of seeing those enemies. But onto Foliage. Essentially what Foliage does is it shows how many trees are going to render in when you're dropping or when you're moving around the map. Having this set to very low is just going to make sure that like trees don't render in as much as they would on say like Ultra. Personally, this is only just for looks. This isn't going to change like any difference between you seeing an enemy or missing an enemy. All this is going to do is render in more trees when you're dropping from the plane and when you're moving around on the map. This is up to you guys if you want to have this set to ultra or very low. This isn't going to make any difference whatsoever to if you see an enemy or if you're going to miss an enemy. It's up to you guys. That's personal preference. The view distance is a very important setting to have on. I personally like to have it set to ultra because I like to have how far like buildings render in. This is only buildings. This isn't like player models or enemies or anything like that. But I feel like having view distance set to ultra instead of having it set lower helps me a lot seeing those enemies that I could possibly miss, because it reduces all noise of like rendering problems that I would have on a lower setting. I just like to have it set to ultra so I can see all the buildings in the distance, like when I'm walking around the map, so I'm not gonna miss maybe an enemy like stood in front of a building, and because that building hasn't rendered in, I'm not gonna miss him. So I personally like to keep that set to ultra. I guess you guys can have a bit of a play around with it, but I would recommend you set this setting to ultra and leave it there, because I think it will help you like not missing those enemies that are maybe stood in front of a building or near a building. Like, you're just not going to miss it because those buildings are going to be rendering in. So on to Sharpen. I recommend that you have this enabled because this is going to increase the clarity that you have on your screen, and it's going to help you spot those enemies at longer distances. Essentially all this does is make the image quality a lot clearer. And why wouldn't you want that on? That's just going to make it a lot easier for you to see enemies at further distances, and it's just going to make things easier for you. I couldn't see a reason why you wouldn't have Sharpen on or anything like that. So just turn this on, guys. This is going to help you see enemies at further distances, and it's just going to make it so much better for you. Okay, so on to VSync. Essentially what VSync does is it caps your frames per second, so it sort of gets rid of screen tearing. I wouldn't recommend using this option because it's going to cap your frames and you're going to get increased input lag if you're using VSync. I'd recommend turning this off. The only time I would recommend using VSync is if you're getting very bad screen tearing and your PC can't really handle it and you have to have VSync on to like completely get rid of that screen tearing. This is the only time I'd recommend using VSync. If you do not have screen tearing and you're using VSync, turn that off right now, because you're going to be getting an increased input lag, which essentially means there's going to be a delay between you using your mouse and like what's happening on your screen, and you're going to decrease your aim ability by a massive margin. Turn VSync off if you don't have screen tearing, guys. Okay, so the last option on this list, guys, is motion blur. Turn this off. You do not need any motion blur within your game. No one wants any blur on their screen because it's just going to make it more difficult for you to spot those enemies at short, medium or long distances. Is very unrequired. You don't need this on. Disable this. I guarantee you anyone that knows what motion blur is going to have this disabled, so you do not need this, guys. Turn this off if you have it enabled. It's really unrequired. I don't even know why it's in the game, to be honest. It's the most pointless setting in this list, and you should disable that straight away. That's going to help you see enemies at those distances. Any distances. It's just going to help you spot enemies easier. So disable that, guys, if you have that enabled. Okay, guys, so that's all from me in this video. I hope this guide helped you. If it did, please drop it a like. Subscribe if you want more content like this. I'm going to be on holiday soon for 2 weeks, so there won't be any content coming up in the next couple of weeks, but I will be making more content when I come back. I'll also be streaming again once I come back. If you don't know already, I stream over on Twitch Monday to Friday, 8 PM GMT. If you would like to drop by live and ask me some questions, I'll leave the link in the description below. But yeah, guys, if this guide did help you, please give it a like, subscribe if you want more content like this, and yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.